So a viewer requested that I play some more Play and Explains, and so I fired up some 20 no limit and 50 no limit. It was in the morning and there weren't that many tables, but I wanted to show you a little bit how I play along with some of the Piosolver analysis next to the actual gameplay, so you can see how my play is actually comparing to the robot. Now, something that I've been experimenting with is using multiple equilibria on the flop. That is, sometimes I'll use like a dipole strategy, sometimes I'll use a polarized strategies of a bunch of, different sizes of bets. And so you'll see me kind of playing around with trying to use different equilibria and bet sizes to keep my opponent off guard, and you'll be kind of seeing the Piosolver suggestions next to what I'm doing based on a little bit of node locking, which I will explain in a moment. Most of the time the Piosolver results you will see are as if I'm playing against a fairly optimal opponent. So I opened King 9 suited in the cutoff, obviously very standard. I really should be opening to 4x because of the rake, but I'm lazy, so I'm just opening to 3.5. And here I flop a gut shot and an overcard, and 2 overcards. And so this is actually a spot where I'm often going to be mixing between my large sizes and small sizes, so I go ahead and start with a check, which PO prefers when I don't have the spades, but obviously I should be checking back spades a little bit of the time. And after my opponent checks to me a second time with so much equity in my hand, a gut shot, so I have like blockers to hands that calls, I have a lot of like decent blockers to attend, this is going to be a very, very mandatory bet. My opponent puts in the min raise, which just seems like shenanigans, right? There really shouldn't be too much of a raising range that my opponent should have here, especially when I have a 9. So despite Piosolver wanting this to be a fold and I should mostly call with clubs, I think this is a spot where my opponent's actually just going to give up on a lot of rivers that I can just blast him, or I could like raise rivers if he bets kind of small. And so this is a spot where when my opponent checks to me, in reality, he should be checking some full houses and a bunch of like 10x to me, but I don't think in real life that my opponent actually has a calling range, and so although Piosolver wants me to check back that river, I just go ahead and shove it in. I think that, a lot of the times, I think there's definitely going to be hands where you see me playing a lot more exploitably than Piosolver will suggest, because obviously I'm not playing against optimal opponents, and so when they're taking lines that Piosolver never recommends, that probably is always going to be an indication that I need to be thinking about deviating as well. I defend 6-8 suited against a full stacked button at 50 no limit, and as you can see, according to the 3 big blind defense, I should be mostly calling with 6-8 suited, so I imagine that I should be calling here the majority of the time when I'm facing a slightly larger pre-flop open, even though the pre-flop open should, make me want to 3-bet a little bit more because I'm incentivized to win the pot immediately a little bit more, especially at these very high-rate games. I flop middle pair with no substantial kicker, start with a check, as I will with the majority of my range here, and the button goes ahead and c-bets a pretty sizable bet, making it 80%, and as you can see, I should just be calling here the majority of the time, even though when I have no backdoors like 8-6 of spades and 8-6 of clubs, these are going to be hands where I should be occasionally raising just to make sure that I have some 6s in my flop check raising range, so I can have 6s in all parts of my game tree. Generally, I'm going to want to check raise my 6s when they have no kickers more often than I want to check raise when I have, say, King 6 or Ace 6, not only because King 6 and Ace 6 can win more often at Showdown, but very often when those hands improve to 2-pair, it's going to improve your opponents to cards that they're going to want to barrel with an Ace or a King. The river comes an Ace, which is obviously better for the button's range than it is for mine, so I'm going to start with a check with the overwhelming majority of the range. I'd probably lead if there was a jack, a 6, sometimes a 2, and now my opponent checks back. And so here on the river, I pretty much have to choose between, do I want to bet 2/3 or do I want to go for a overbet? And so when the river comes a 6, this is going to be a card that's just much better for me than it is going to be for my opponent. And so I'm definitely going to want to size up with the majority of my range. especially because my opponent should be representing a couple ace X's with no kicker when he checks back the turn, as well as some jack X which checks back the turn. And because there were a bunch of misdraws on the flop, I think an overbet is going to look really suspicious, and it's going to be kind of my default betting size there when I am bluffing, or when I show up with a hand like ace queen, 2 pair, and then obviously all of my 6x type hands. When people say that the 1/3 betting style is not maximally exploitative, they rarely don't know what they're talking about because they've not actually had experience with the style. So this is one of the really illustrative hands of why betting 1/3 really confuses your opponents and makes a ton of money, both from a GTO perspective and from an exploitative standpoint. So I isolate a dabbing panda with queen 10, and if I have to choose between betting and checking with a 1/3 pot size bet, clearly GTO indicates that I should bet nearly 100% of my range, and indeed if my opponent is looser than my model, GTO will want me to bet as often as possible and really try to push my equity advantage and push the fact that my opponent is rarely going to have enough hands that have enough equity to even call a 1/3 pot size bet. Turn 6 is one of the worst cards in the deck for me. I think when my opponent check calls the flop, he's got bad queens, a lot of 6x and overcards, and so if he's got like a queen 10 or queen 9 type hand, well, the problem is I block queen 10 with a 10 myself, so it pushes my opponent to be slightly more likely to have 6x type hands. And if he's got like overcards or draws to middle pair type hands, well, I want him to catch up and then pay me off when I still have top pair. Also, if I check back here, a lot of opponents are going to confuse my betting the flop small, checking back the turn as a sign of extreme weakness, and you'll find that a lot of people are going to try to go for it against you. The river jack is an essential blank. My opponent pots it, and as you can see, I should just automatically snap here. I should probably call with any queen 6, possibly every 4 here. But there's no reason to ever consider folding a queen despite my opponent sizing up here. This is a spot where if my opponent bet like $7, $8, this is probably going to be a pretty easy snap at a higher stakes game when my opponents are going to be a little bit more balanced with their entire range, and against a lower stakes opponent, maybe I could think about a fold, but obviously going to snap here. This really reminds me of a hand that I played at the Neeme meetup in Chicago. It was a 1-3 with a $6 straddle. The under the gun player limps, I isolate him with ace jack off suit. The flop comes jack high, I bet a third, he calls. The turn comes a queen. I check back my second pair, and then my opponent leads about 80% of the pot into me, and I snap call, obviously. And then he shows me ace king, which is a similar hand to ace 2 in that he's calling the flop because he thinks that he might have a little bit of showdown value with his ace high. Obviously, ace king has quite a bit of showdown value against a 1/3 pot size bet. But when the turn checks back and he leads the river, that doesn't really make any sense, because if you're calling with these hands thinking that you can show down successfully, then there's no reason to turn those hands into a bluff when the turn checks back and you now are at the river, right? Your hand should play much better as a check call or check fold on the river, rather than a river lead. And if you're leading there with a hand like ace 2 or ace king, it probably means that you have way too many bluffs, and that you're going to be spewing really badly against all of my queen x or 4x type hands, all of my middle pairs that are just going to check back and then snap the river against your very wide range. So this is a very common trap that you can set for your opponents. When you bet 1/3, after the turn goes check, your opponents are just going to completely misunderstand what your range is, and then you're going to pick up some free money, regardless if they bet or check. It doesn't really matter what they do. They're going to make poor assumptions about your range and then make mistakes against you. Again, if you only play the classic large bet or check strategies here, you're never going to get to this part of the game tree where you can see, oh wow, these guys have some horrific exploits that I should be taking advantage of. Here I open in the cutoff and the small blind calls with only 33 big blinds here, and so This is going to be a spot where, one, I probably didn't really notice his stack size because I was 6-tabling, but because the small blind is going to be unusually strong here, I think this is a board where I can stand to mix it up with ace-10, and rather than just bet 1/3 100% of the time, I can go ahead and check back. So this model that I've made is assuming an opponent is playing 100 big blinds here, but again, because the small blind is going to be really strong, I think that rather than depolarizing here, I can go ahead and have some kind of bet or check range, in which case ace-10 is probably going to be near the bottom of my betting range. It's probably pretty close here. Maybe if I have the ace of diamonds, I should be betting a little bit more often than if I had like the ace of hearts. But it should be a relatively small difference over my entire equilibria. So I check back. The turn is a 9 and my opponent checks to me. And so if there was any turn that I wanted to set a trap twice, it's definitely going to be this one. So first off, if I'm ahead and my opponent has air, I'm going to want to check here and induce and let my opponent just stab at me on the river. If my opponent has improved, obviously he's got trips and I don't want to put any money in, so I should check back. And if my opponent has some kind of ace-x type hand, it's probable that I would have heard about it by now. He probably would have led the turn. So the only hand that I'm really going to be losing value against is a ace-x type hand that really wanted to check call the turn and check call the river. So my opponent bets the river, and so if I was taking this line to minimize my losses against a 9x and maximize the times that my opponent have total air, then definitely want to just be calling here instead of raising, because raising won't accomplish anything against the specific strategies that I was targeting. And finally, a 3-bet pot that reinforces the importance of having a defended check calling range. I raise from the small blind with 40 to 45% of hands, and my opponent goes ahead and 3-bets me, and for the most part I'm just going to call, almost never going to fold this, and occasionally King-Jack is going to be a decent hand to 4-bet because I have a lot of blockers against my opponent's 5-bet all-in range. Here on 10-10-4, I definitely want to start with a check. On 10-10-4, you know, I can have a bunch of 10s, my opponent can have a bunch of 10s, but he's going to have all the aces, kings, queens, etc. So definitely going to want to start with a check. And when my opponent checks back, I think very often he's got like ace, king, king, queen type hands that have a little bit of showdown value. And so when the turn comes a king, the king is actually really good for my opponent, and so despite having top pair, it's extremely important to start this turn with a check call. And so I think a lot of players just play their hand really, really straightforwardly here, and they'll just like bet the turn and bet the river, and that is definitely not the most profitable way to play this hand. And the standard line here is going to be to check call and then check call the river, because you know, if you lead a King X type hand here and you never have a King X type hand in your check calling range, it's pretty hard for you to show up with a check call turn, check call river range that is not going to get completely run over by your uncapped opponent. So here I check the turn, and Pio generally starts with a check call here. The river is essentially a blank here, and obviously when the river's a blank, I'm not going to really have a donking range, so I'm going to start with a river check. And when my opponent bets, when he bets 2/3, it's going to be pretty close here. Again, we said that a lot of our opponents checking back range on the flop is going to be hands that have some kind of pair value or showdown value, so it's going to be a lot of like ace king, king queen, ace queen type hands. I mean, king queen probably is a pretty good hand to just bet the flop and then barrel off, but you know, ace king is definitely going to be a strong part of my opponent's check back and then bet the turn range. And so it's not a snap with King Jack here, but generally if you're playing against opponents who are going to be over-aggressive when you show a lot of weakness, you're definitely going to want to check all the turn and then just close your eyes and pretty much just call down on the river. Again, if you're playing against an opponent who has really good frequencies and is going to be only betting with a very balanced range here, then it's going to be a little bit closer, as Pio suggests. But against your standard player, this is just going to be a call, and maybe you can fold like King 6 suited or some other King X type hands that you call a 3-bet with pre-flop. So definitely a couple of interesting spots, definitely a couple spots where I said, screw PO, let's just go for it because, you know, my opponent deviated, and that's always an indication that I'm going to be deviating myself. And so, despite mostly going for the exploitative flex here, I really need to emphasize that I can't possibly know where all these signposts are for me to deviate from GTO unless I know what optimal is in the first place. So, you know, when my opponents have leading ranges that don't really make any sense, or, you know, when they're using bet sizes that don't make any sense, and that's always going to be a very clear indication that I should be playing a non-GTO line myself. However, if you don't know what quote-unquote optimal play looks like in the first place, how can you possibly know when your opponent is taking a line that theoretically doesn't make any sense and be able to develop a punishing counterattack? So I hope this new video format worked out. As always, if you have any questions, please hit me up in the comments. Please like and subscribe because I always appreciate all of your support. If you are interested in the analysis that I do and how I apply it to live cash games, please check out my cash game course at overnightmonster.com. And otherwise, good luck.